Why was the simplest mark on her skin the heaviest burden she carried? The chow line stretched, a seemingly infinite, shimmering ribbon of khaki and fatigue, across the vast, sun-drenched yard of Camp Hawthorne, beneath the relentless, unforgiving glare of the midday sun. The ground, a mix of hard-packed earth and fine, ubiquitous dust, was ground constantly by the treads of countless boots. The friction produced a low, continuous grinding hiss. That was the sonic signature of the entire base. The heat itself was not just atmospheric. It was a dry physical weight, a continuous, choking pressure that settled deep into the lungs and made the smallest exertion, even the simple act of standing still, feel like an act of profound endurance. Small talk, like moisture, died instantly in the throat. Patience was an evaporated commodity, a luxury long since surrendered to the relentless cycle of duty and fatigue. It was the same rhythm, every day, every minute of her life in this place. The aggressive, metallic scrape of the aluminum trays, being dragged along the dented stainless steel rails. The low, continuous, almost mournful muttering of complaints about the lack of flavor, the sameness of the rations, or the omnipresent sand, and the short, brittle bursts of exhausted laughter that quickly dissolved, unable to sustain themselves against the collective, heavy silence of focused hunger. Private First Class Emily Parker stood, as always, utterly rooted in the queue, a perfect, unwavering study in self-imposed restraint and rigid discipline. Her shoulders were set, squared almost aggressively, her posture a silent, powerful defense mechanism against the chaotic environment, and more importantly, against the casual, inevitable scrutiny of her peers. She was a woman trying with an almost desperate intensity to vanish into the mundane, to blend perfectly into the backdrop of clipboards, regulatory codes, and administrative invisibility. Her sleeves were rolled, adhering precisely to the mandated field regulation for heat, pulled back exactly 2 fingers, width above the wrist, exposing the delicate inner skin of her forearm. And that in the vast, anonymous camouflage-draped landscape of Camp Hawthorne was the precise, specific source of all the casual, cruel commentary, the gravitational center of all the unspoken judgment. The ink, a small yet impossibly vibrant monarch butterfly, resting in stark, fragile contrast on the pale, usually shielded skin of her forearm. It was an anomaly, an almost offensive burst of orange, black, and white, a piece of fragile, unnecessary biological beauty, set against the relentless khaki, the weary olive drab, and the pervasive, inescapable grime of a military forward operating base. A group of infantrymen, young, loud, and confident, in the untainted, aggressive purity of their combat arms designation, stood just behind her, restless with the physical tension of too much recent field time and too little rest. They were tired, frustrated by the heat, and looking for an easy, low-consequence target to release the pressure. One of them, a specialist named Hicks, known for his volume and his lack of imagination, caught sight of the mark. He didn't just notice it, he framed it in the language of derision. His smirk was a slow, deliberate performance, his words pitched precisely high enough for his entire cohort, and anyone within a 20-foot radius, to catch the precise, cutting edge of the joke. Look at that, boys, what's she gonna do? Flutter at the enemy? Distract 'em with its pretty wings? The laughter that followed was not the kind that eases tension or creates camaraderie. It was profoundly dismissive, a low, collective roar of derision and judgment. It was the heavy, crushing sound of assumed competence, judging a perceived aesthetic and professional mistake. of hard, essential men judging a woman they assumed was fundamentally soft, hopelessly civilian, and safely cocooned by paperwork from the real, bloody edge of the conflict. It was the sound of othering, the military's quiet, cruel way of defining who belongs, and more importantly, who does not. Emily didn't flinch. The temptation to break her stillness, to turn and use a single, perfectly aimed phrase, perhaps a specific, classified detail of their recent field exercises. Only she, the logistics clerk, had the clearance to see, to instantly incinerate their assumptions, was a tiny, electric buzz deep in her chest, a familiar, controlled twitch of the predator she once was. But she suppressed it instantly, violently, pushing the feeling back down beneath layers of discipline and practiced silence. She didn't turn. She had practiced this perfect stillness, this absolute erasure of self, for 3 long, agonizing years. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead on the steam table, focusing with obsessive intensity on the distorted reflection of the fluorescent lights in the metal serving trays. Her gaze locked onto the mundane task ahead. The tray remained steady in her hands, a testament to an iron control that had been forged in high-altitude cold and extreme duress. Her only visible, organic movement, the slow, shallow, barely detectable rise and fall of her chest beneath the heavy cotton t-shirt. Silence, she had learned, was not just her defense. It was her sanctuary, her penance, and her only functional identity. They thought they knew her. They saw a desk jockey, a paper pusher, a clerk, with a childish, wholly inappropriate tattoo, a logistical anomaly best ignored. They could not, see the designation hidden beneath the surface. They did not see the thin, jagged white scar that ran parallel to the vibrant ink, a line almost entirely masked by the orange wing. Emily Parker was, by the official record, 28 years old, assigned solely to the logistics division at Camp Hawthorne. Her world, by choice, was an unforgiving landscape of clipboards, encrypted digital manifests, and endless, meticulous supply reports detailing every screw, every gallon, every bandage, while others spent their days training for kinetic engagement, rehearsing the complex choreography of survival and destruction. She made absolutely certain they had the gear, the specialized ammunition, the jet fuel, the precision optics, the critical medical supplies, to survive it. It was a necessary, thankless, and utterly unsung task. She was the anchor point, the logistical glue holding the vast, chaotic global machinery of the base together. And she was, by every metric available, professionally flawless. Her bunk was always squared away. Geometric perfection, enforced in canvas and wool. Her paperwork never displayed a single discrepancy, a single miscounted bolt, or a single misplaced signature. Every morning she arrived 30 minutes early, her boots polished to a mirror shine that reflected the sterile light. Every night she left 30 minutes late, after meticulously clearing her desk and wiping down the surface. It was a rigorous, self-imposed penance. This relentless, perfect mediocrity. It was a punishment for the crime of being alive when others were not. But sometimes, late at night, when the sterile, buzzing light of the single fluorescent tube above her desk was the only thing cutting the utter desert darkness outside, the carefully constructed routine cracked open. A memory, cold, jagged, and precise, would pierce the silence in her mind. The white-hot, unexpected flash of muzzle fire that did not belong to her unit's protocol. The acrid, sickening smell of ozone, burnt rock, and spilled aviation fuel. And a desperate, half-formed whisper in her earpiece that ended abruptly, violently. choked off by static and distance. The monarch tattoo wasn't the result of a drunken whim or youthful rebellion during a brief shore leave. It was the solemn, unofficial personal seal of a high-tier reconnaissance and direct action unit that, on paper, had been liquidated and officially did not exist. A team of specialists who had dissolved, vanished into history and classified files. 3 years prior in a high-altitude, unforgiving cold. The team was designated Chrysalis, and the monarch was the unit's shared, darkly humorous internal joke. The final, beautiful, fleeting form rising only after the deadly, high-stakes cocoon of their work was shattered. Every member, every specialist had one. Except now, she was the only one left to carry the mark. And it felt heavier than any piece of body armor she had ever worn. She hadn't told anyone this. Not the major who signed her reports. Not the base counselor who would try to clinically dissect her past. And certainly not the loud, mocking soldiers standing 2 paces behind her, smelling faintly of sweat and cheap aftershave. She never would. That quiet secret was the fundamental reason she chose the stultifying, absolute safety of bureaucracy and the logistics cage. It was the reason the butterfly felt like a brand of shame and survival. She lived with the constant, grinding, relentless, anxious fear that the past would finally find her, that the immense, catastrophic failure of Operation Chrysalis would follow her even here, to the dusty edge of nowhere. She just wanted the quiet. She just wanted the silence, believing that in stillness there was total, unassailable safety. As she finally reached the front of the line, accepting a ladleful of lukewarm mashed potatoes, accepting the starch and flavorlessness as yet another form of professional and personal penance. A runner, a young, nervous, sweating specialist from the comms center, his eyes wide and panicked, tapped her discreetly on the shoulder. He didn't speak the message aloud, his throat too dry, his mission too sensitive. He just showed her the coded summons slip, holding it flat against his sweating palm. It was a 4-digit numerical sequence she hadn't seen, or even heard whispered, in over 3 years of dedicated silence. A sequence that meant the immediate, unavoidable, and final end of the quiet. The immediate, unavoidable end of the silence. It meant the past was not only finding her, it was calling her back into the field, demanding payment for her continued, undeserved survival. The tray remained steady in her hands, but her world had just violently shifted on its axis. She opened the envelope, and the name staring back at her was supposed to be dead, an impossible revival that struck her with the force of an oncoming train. The paper, cheap and thin, felt not like a feather but like a sheet of lead, radiating an icy cold despite the pervasive heat of the base. The sudden, violent disruption to her self-imposed order was a physical shock, a deep physiological tremor that she fought to conceal behind her practiced, neutral expression. She carefully tucked the summons into the pocket of her fatigues, her movements slow, deliberate, a masterclass in controlled response. The chow line moved on, but she stood still for a second too long, processing the name and the code. A flicker of pure, unadulterated dread mixing with a terrifying, professional elation. The logistics desk, her sanctuary, felt a million miles away. The meeting took place an hour later, held in a windowless concrete bunker, a subterranean space drilled deep beneath the base, far removed from the sun-drenched chaos and casual cruelty of the logistics yard. She passed through 3 security checkpoints, each one manned by silent, severe Marines, who didn't recognize her, didn't question her code, and didn't meet her eye. The air conditioning was set impossibly cold, a deliberate atmospheric choice designed to sharpen the mind and induce a subtle, continuous physiological stress. It smelled faintly of ozone, old brittle paper files, and the sharp chemical tang of classified document destruction. Across the scarred steel table sat Colonel Avery. He wasn't one of the frontline men who smelled of cordite and sweat. He was pure intelligence, a handler whose entire existence was dedicated to managing dangerous secrets and even more dangerous assets. His eyes were flat, deep-set, and carried the perpetual heavy shadow of too much dark knowledge and too many compromises. He placed a single, thin, manila dossier on the table, sliding it across the slick metallic surface with meticulous, ritualistic care, as if the folder itself were toxic. The accompanying photograph was grainy, aged, taken under poor lighting. Yet the face was utterly unmistakable. The face of a man she knew better than her own reflection. The voice that still haunted her deepest silences. The file was labeled, in stark, unforgiving black lettering, MIA presumed killed. Emily's free hand, resting on her knee beneath the table, went instinctively to her forearm. A phantom weight on the monarch tattoo, the ink suddenly burning against her skin. A physical echo of the trauma. The man in the photo was Marcus Thorne, her old partner, her spotter, her voice in the dark, designated Chrysalis7, the man who should have died 3 years ago. "We gotta whisper, Parker," Avery said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to struggle against the cold air. A digital ghost. A comms ping from the last known location of Operation Chrysalis. The Black Sea sector. He paused, letting the geopolitical weight of the sector sink in. Emily felt the blood drain from her face in an immediate, paralyzing rush, replaced by a cold, dreadful certainty that seized her gut and made her teeth clench. The initial failure had been so complete, so politically disastrous, that the entire sector had been politically and operationally sterilized. An area wiped clean of all Western operational presence. It was a dead zone, a geographic erasure. No one was supposed to be there. Thorne was supposed to be a memory, a name inscribed on a polished stone, buried under rock and ice in a forgotten mountain pass. "He's alive," she stated, the words clipped and flat, the tone not seeking confirmation, but stating a dreadful, sinking certainty. She saw the full, terrible truth in Avery's tired eyes before he even spoke. The silent acknowledgement of the nightmare coming back to life. "Or someone is using his encryption key," Avery corrected, leaning forward slightly, his forearms resting on the steel table, which, in this context, given the level of access required to operate in that area, amounts to the same profound, non-negotiable threat. We need to know who is transmitting, and we need to retrieve the data they're sending before it falls into the wrong, very dangerous hands. Specifically, the data pertaining to Chrysalis Prime. The mission profile, as Avery laid it out in short, precise, brutal sentences, was impossible. A ghost task designed for legend, not reality. It was a deep cover, solo penetration into a densely hostile, politically unstable territory. A unilateral, high-risk extraction designed for a two-person team, now relegated to one. He then delivered the unavoidable, terrible blow, his voice devoid of emotion. "You're going alone, Parker. You are the only one who knows the team's original, highly compartmentalized insertion vectors. Their dead drops, their specific, last-ditch emergency protocols, and the political geography of the original target zone. You are, unfortunately, the only living asset with the foundational knowledge to navigate that field without broadcasting your intent." Avery didn't need to ask if she was ready. He simply observed the subtle, instantaneous hardening of her jaw. and the sudden clarity in her eyes. The corrosive background anxiety of leaving that immense, unresolved failure hanging had been a continuous, low-grade torture in her life. Now, the overwhelming, singular determination to finish it, to finally close that gaping, 3-year-old loop, was a rush of raw adrenaline, focused purpose, and professional relief that bordered on the terrifying. She had sworn she was done with the high-stakes, high-consequence world, that the failures of the past would remain safely buried. But leaving Thorne's fate, or the fate of the critical intel he carried, unresolved was a greater, more agonizing burden than any deployment could be. Her inner conflict raged, a furious, internal war she had been fighting since the Chow line. The deep-seated, justifiable fear of history repeating itself, of more catastrophic loss and more dead friends, fought violently against the absolute, non-negotiable loyalty to her old teammate, the man who had shared the last, terrible moments of the team's operational life. She looked at the grainy photo again, the face of the man who bore the same small butterfly on his arm. The monarch felt like a connection, a commitment. "I'll need my original kit," she said, her voice steady now, purged completely of the logistics clerk's monotonous tone, replaced by the quiet, dangerous precision of Chrysalis7. Avery nodded, a minimal, almost invisible gesture of understanding. "It's waiting for you in Armory 4. But Parker," he added, his voice dropping to a final, chilling warning whisper, "be aware if you are compromised. We have no record of this meeting, this mission, or your existence. Beyond the logistics desk at Camp Hawthorne. You are a ghost, and ghosts leave no paper trail. You are completely alone out there." He emphasized the chilling name, Chrysalis Prime. The name of the objective she had sacrificed everything. Her rank, her reputation, her team. To protect 3 years ago. The greatest suspense in that cold, silent room was no longer whether she would survive the physical journey, but whether she could endure the memories, the terrible, haunting truths that were waiting for her at the destination. The data might be compromised, but the failure was her own to bear. And now finally to face head-on. She was going back into the cold. The price of survival was finally due, and she was ready to pay. She reached for the old rifle case, and the dust on the latch felt like a decade of regret, a heavy, visible film of failure and inactivity that clung to the metallic surface. The transition from the clinical cold of the intelligence bunker to the industrial quiet of the armory was a profound shift, a return to the tactile reality of her trade. Armory 4 was a deeper circle of cold silence, a place echoing not with sound, but with the weighty absence of lives. A museum of classified tools. It was filled with equipment meant only for missions, that were either too secret to ever discuss, or too spectacularly failed to ever repeat. Her specialized kit was waiting, tagged and sealed in a heavy metal cage. Since her immediate demotion and subsequent reassignment, she signed the release form with a pen that felt foreign and light in her hand. The act of bureaucratic record-keeping, a final, ironic counterpoint to the ghost mission she was about to undertake. The polyester logistics uniform felt thin, false, and utterly insulting. As she stripped it off, letting the heap of khaki pool on the floor like a discarded skin, the gear locker smelled exactly right. A scent that triggered a cascade of muscle memory and professional focus. Metallic, oily, faintly of cleaning solvent. New plastic explosives. An old, familiar canvas. It was the rich, intoxicating scent of consequence and competency. Her main tool, the instrument of her unique, terrifying trade, was a customized, long-range precision rifle. A dark, matte black piece of engineered silence. a chassis optimized for cold weather and impossible distance. It wasn't just a gun. It was a calibrated extension of her will, designed for non-negotiable targets and absolute terminal accuracy. As she worked, her movements were economical, meticulous, and entirely automatic. A subconscious performance refined by years of repetitive drilling. She checked the bolt's action, verifying the perfect smoothness of the firing cycle, adjusted the fine-tuned optics for zero ambient light, and calibrated the complex thermal overlay, all while a deep sense of professional isolation settled around her. This refined, specialized skill set, this utterly lonely, high-consequence mission, this was who she truly was, stripped away from the clipboards and the superficial pleasantries of administrative life. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the self-imposed safety she had been living. Administration offered order, a flimsy, intellectual concept of control over an uncontrollable, chaotic world. Warfare, this kind of warfare, was the brutal opposite. It was pure chaos managed by pure, individual discipline. Immediate consequence, an absolute, unforgiving self-reliance. She had been an anchor in the logistics yard. Now she was an island, choosing deliberately to cast herself back into the dangerous, freezing ocean. She retrieved her ghillie suit, the heavy, layered camouflage a strange, familiar comfort against her skin, the synthetic strands smelling faintly of pine and dirt. Running her fingers over the earthen strands, she checked the pockets for any accidental debris. Deep inside one of the chest pouches, preserved perfectly by the original vacuum seal, her fingers brushed against something delicate, something thin, something utterly out of place in a tool of war. She pulled it out. It was a small, creased piece of paper, folded many times over, softened by the sweat and time of 3 years ago. It was a child's drawing, rendered in bright, naive, almost violent crayon. A disproportionate house, 2 stick figures with oversized smiles, and a large, oddly shaped butterfly, drawn with the same vibrant colors as the ink on her arm. It was from the tiny, isolated village near the original target area, given to Thorne by a little girl, just hours before everything went sideways, before the extraction window closed and the world exploded. It was a silent, heartbreaking reminder that their mission, even when technical success was tragically forfeited, had always been about saving some piece of humanity. It was the memory of the moral choice. She had been the one who insisted on saving those children, diverting the extraction route, even though the delay cost them critical minutes and alerted the enemy to their presence. That choice, the moral one, the human one, was the seed of the initial catastrophic failure, and the undeniable root of her demotion and her exile to the paper trails. She stood there, holding the fragile drawing, the quiet, almost arrogant pride in her singular skill, tempered by the sharp, debilitating anguish of that memory. The choice, she reflected, was the only thing that mattered in the end. Protocol was a guideline, a blueprint for efficiency. Humanity was a constant, a weight that could not be shed. The drawing was a raw, visceral affirmation of her true purpose, a purpose the logistics yard had tried for years to suppress under mountains of manifests. She carefully tucked the drawing into her own kit, a heavy talisman of guilt and loyalty. Her hands, calloused from years of pulling incredibly tight triggers with impossible precision, now worked with a determined, renewed sense of professional purpose. She checked every item, every battery, every pound of her operational load, calculating the weight distribution against her own body mass, optimizing for minimal fatigue during the expected 48 hours of constant movement. The logistics clerk was gone, perhaps forever. She was preparing not just for a mission. She was preparing for a definitive, violent confrontation with the most painful truth of her past, a reckoning with the ghost she had been running from, her entire being focused on the cold steel and the dark mission ahead, driven by a quiet, burning resolution. The redemption, she knew, would not be given. It would have to be taken, centimeter by agonizing centimeter. The armory door hissed shut behind her, sealing her into the darkness, leaving only the echo of her determined steps. The ramp dropped open into the night sky, and the world below disappeared instantly in a sheet of high-altitude ice and a storm of wind that stole the breath right out of her lungs. There was only the vast, howling void, a black abyss of freezing air and distant stars. The transport plane, a heavy anonymous C-130 shell, disguised as a routine weather surveillance aircraft, was an iron coffin rattling its way through the upper atmosphere. The air inside the unpressurized hold was thin, cold, and utterly unforgiving, forcing every breath to be a conscious, deliberate effort. Emily stood braced by the open ramp, the void staring back at her, its sheer blackness intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. The wind screamed past the opening, a constant, physical assault that threatened to tear her equipment from her moorings, a deafening sound that required all her concentration to ignore. This was the HAHO jump, high altitude, high opening. The most dangerous, the most vulnerable, and the most invisible phase of the insertion. The secrecy was non-negotiable. No one could know she was coming. The drop zone was a mountainous, desolate pocket nestled deep in the contested Black Sea region, a place notorious for its sheer, unforgiving rock faces, its aggressive anti-air surveillance, and its hidden, clandestine military infrastructure. She wore a dedicated oxygen mask, the air feed hissing faintly against the roaring wind, her helmet comms crackling with the pilot's final, terse clearance words. Green light in T-10 seconds. Good luck, Chrysalis. The use of her old call sign, a name erased from all living rosters, was a sudden, jarring reminder of the stakes. Below her, the earth was not a welcoming sight, but a dark, obscured promise, shrouded in swirling, icy cloud banks that looked like cotton shrouds. She took a final, deep, deliberate breath, drawing the pure O2 deep into her lungs, holding it for 3 beats before releasing it slowly. It was a breath not of fear, which she had long ago surgically sublimated into focus, but of absolute, chilling, professional concentration. 987. Her mind raced through the contingency plan, reviewing the subtle mid-air corrections she would need to make to account for the unexpected wind shear. She felt the heavy weight of the monarch tattoo, an anchor on her arm, a reminder of the man waiting below. 3, 2, 1. Then the green light flashed, a stark, sudden beacon in the darkness. And then she was gone. The transition from the relative safety of the aircraft to the outside void was violent. A sudden, brutal expulsion into the freezing nothingness. She executed the exit maneuver perfectly, ensuring her body was stable before the canopy deployed. The chute opened immediately with a punishing, neck-snapping snap, the sound swallowed instantly by the roaring wind, yanking her violently upward and then leaving her suspended, swinging like a pendulum beneath a silent, dark canopy. She was a ghost now, drifting through the dark, icy layers, steering by the faint, cold glow of the impossibly distant stars, and the constant, microscopic data projection inside her visor, which showed altitude, drift, and target vector. Every sensory input was magnified, distorted by the altitude and the extreme cold. The constant, deafening roar of the wind in her ears, the metallic taste of cold air on her tongue, the tiny, almost musical vibrations of the parachute lines singing above her hands. The anxiety she carried was not paralyzing. It was a highly sharpened, essential tool, like a surgical blade. It kept her vigilant, hyper-aware of the slightest shift in wind direction, the subtle flicker of anti-air radar on the ground miles below. Her descent was measured, controlled, and utterly alone, a solitary speck against the vast canvas of the night. Landing was rough, a jarring bone-deep impact in a steep, icy scrub of brittle, frozen brush. The moment her feet touched the ground, the military machine took over. Overriding the pain, she immediately cut the chute, efficiently burying the vast, telltale silk beneath rocks and snow, scattering the debris so no single piece remained visible. The silence of the mountain descended, oppressive and complete, heavier than the cold air. The sheer, relentless cold was the first enemy to engage, a physical force trying to leach the heat, the life, right out of her bones. She was detached, an anonymous, untraceable figure wrapped in camouflage. But the detachment was a professional facade. She felt every meter, every foot, every granule of dirt she had to traverse, the logistical weight of the failure on her shoulders. She was carrying the shame of the logistics yard, the echo of the mocking laughter, and the immense, unresolved burden of Chrysalis7. Then, as she was securing her first perimeter, establishing a safe zone to retrieve her rifle from its carrying case, the ghost of her past materialized in her ear. A faint, almost lost frequency crackled to life in her comms unit. It was unauthorized, a non-standard military channel, and she recognized the digital signature immediately. It was Thorne's frequency, his personal, encrypted call sign. It was a short, stuttered burst of Morse code, repeating urgently, a pattern she and Thorne had created for emergencies. HANGAR, BLACKIS, BURNING. The cryptic message was urgent, raw, and deeply unsettling. It confirmed he was alive, which was a moment of shocking, profound relief that she immediately forced into a tactical box. But the location, an old, abandoned Soviet comms compound known only as Black Hangar, was infinitely more hostile and heavily guarded than the original target zone. And the final phrase confirmed that the situation was, without any doubt, critical. Her determination hardened into cold, dark steel. She was no longer hunting an asset for data retrieval. She was hunting a brother, running toward a fire she had inadvertently started 3 years ago. And the high-altitude cold was suddenly secondary to the burning need for vengeance and retrieval. She had to find him. The dust on the floor of the abandoned road was undisturbed, thick and pervasive, settling into every rut and tire mark. But the shadow in the corner of her vision, cast by a distant, flickering guard tower light, moved subtly when she breathed, an unnerving, hyper-focused observation. The journey from the drop zone to the Black Hangar was not a casual hike. It was a silent, grueling 2-day stalk. A continuous, low-profile hunt against an environment that was actively hostile, and an enemy who knew the exact geographical target area. It took Emily nearly 48 hours of unrelenting, low-profile movement, utilizing every canyon, every piece of scrub, every geological feature that offered even momentary concealment. She low-crawled through frozen ravines, utilizing cover that seemed too sparse to conceal anything larger than a rabbit, and navigated by the primal instinct honed over years of specialized, high-stakes training. This desolate realm was where her skill was not merely an asset, but an absolute, non-negotiable necessity for survival. Every step was a careful study in physics, consequence, and camouflage, maximizing ground speed while minimizing visual and thermal signature. She moved with the fluid, low center of gravity grace of a predator, who knows instinctively that it is surrounded and watched. Her long-range precision training wasn't simply about the act of firing a weapon. It was fundamentally about the stalk, the patient, zero-error penetration of hostile space, the ability to close the distance without detection. She measured the wind not just for ballistics, but for scent dispersion, and listened for the distant, faint sounds of internal combustion engines and human voices. She read the ground like a detailed, high-resolution map, identifying the faint scuff marks of a non-military issue boot, the specific tread of an armored utility vehicle, the discarded casing of a weapon that was definitely not issued to local government forces, indicating the presence of a specialized, non-state actor. The objective, the Black Hangar, was an isolated former Soviet comm station, a jagged, brutal skeleton of concrete and steel clinging precariously to the side of a sheer cliff face. Its appearance was imposing, its function clearly clandestine and highly secured. The silence surrounding it was too perfect, too complete. The kind of silence that screamed ambush and trap. A carefully constructed environment designed to lull an inexperienced operative into a false sense of security. She finally settled into her primary overwatch position, a high, cramped perch she had located 2 miles away, overlooking the main access road and the compound's rear perimeter. She was nestled deep into a snow-covered crag, her body perfectly still, the scope an unmoving, cold eye fixed on the target. Her internal monologue was purely tactical, a continuous, running calculation. Range to main gate, 950 meters. Wind steady, 5 knots right to left, consistent compensation needed. Patrol pattern, 2-man teams, rotating every 30 minutes, predictable, lazy. A clear sign of overconfidence bordering on arrogance. But even as she was immersed entirely in the complex calculus of risk assessment and target acquisition, another quieter, deeply human thought surfaced. The profound, almost aching loneliness of the task. She was a silent, unseen guardian. Her only interaction with the world, the cold, impersonal glass of her scope. Yet paradoxically, this was the only place she felt a potent, undeniable sense of self. A complete congruence between her identity and her utility. The logistics office had been the lie. This frozen mountain peak was the brutal, clarifying truth. This inner strength, derived from absolute self-reliance and the knowledge of her specific lethal capacity, was the true thing they mocked in the Chow line. They saw a butterfly. She knew it represented the silent, lethal precision of a highly specialized operative. A skill set that saved lives but cost her everything. She spent an hour mapping the compound's vulnerabilities, creating a detailed digital blueprint inside her head, noting the position of every external camera, every lighting fixture, every thermal exhaust port. As the sun began its brutal, theatrical descent, painting the harsh, icy snow in shades of violet and blood orange, she noticed the anomaly. A faint, barely perceptible flicker in the recessed loading dock. A movement that did not conform to the wind or the settling dust that lay thick upon the ground. It was an absence of movement in an area that should have been chaotic with air currents. It was something waiting with terrifying stillness. She slowly, carefully brought the scope to bear, her body tensing, her finger resting lightly on the cold steel of the trigger guard. It was a sniper's shadow, the subtle, high-profile silhouette of a man too still, too low profile, waiting for her specific line of approach. The enemy knew she was coming. They had allowed the beacon to transmit, knowing her loyalty would pull her in, using Thorn as bait. The initial suspense is Thorn alive. was replaced by a chilling new question. Who else had survived the truth of Operation Chrysalis? And what did they know about her? The mission had shifted again. This wasn't just retrieval. It was survival against a deeply informed enemy. The only way in was through the shadow, and that required absolute, unforgiving terminal silence. She drew a slow, stabilizing breath, the cold air burning her lungs. The logistics world was utterly, finally gone. She found the source of the beacon, but the retrieval target wasn't what anyone expected, shattering her final illusion of order. The man who had been her partner was now a ghost of himself. An impossible distortion that mocked her entire 3 years of self-imposed penance. The infiltration was executed with the relentless, zero-error standard of her unit. A true masterclass in ghosting a hostile perimeter. She utilized the single blind spot of the stationary sniper, the one she had patiently identified from her perch, leveraging the noise of the nightly wind shift to mask the tiny, almost imperceptible snap of her gear securing against the rock face. She moved like smoke, a dark whisper against the concrete and ice, utilizing a sequence of movements that required agonizing control and strength. The final confrontation with the waiting sniper was clean, silent, and entirely necessary. A single, close-range dart of paralyzing venom to the neck. Injected with a spring-loaded wrist device, she had long since retired, neutralizing the threat without a sound, leaving the man paralyzed but alive. A testament to her preference for minimal, controlled violence. Inside the black hangar, the air was immediately thick and choking, with the metallic smell of stale, dried blood, and the acrid stench of burnt wiring and stressed batteries. The change in atmosphere was a physical assault. She moved through the abandoned, cavernous concrete halls, her suppressed rifle leading, her eyes absorbing every piece of visual data. She was reading the kinetic residue of a recent, frantic struggle. Overturned chairs, deep drag marks in the dust, and the dull gleam of spent shell casings that didn't match the ammunition she had observed the perimeter guards using, indicating a specialized, internal skirmish. She followed the distinct trail of scorched wire and a faint, rhythmic, heartbreaking sound. A shallow, painful, wet cough that echoed through the empty space. It led her deep into the facility, past vast, empty storage areas, to a central server room, the heart of the compound's intelligence gathering. Now dark, cold, and stripped bare of most functional components. And there he was, Marcus Thorne. But the retrieval target was a devastating, heartbreaking distortion of the confident, laughing Chrysalis 4 she remembered. He was shackled to a rusted pipe, his body broken, his uniform a tattered, filth-caked mess, a deep, infected wound weeping visibly on his side, his skin pale and almost translucent. His beard was overgrown, his eyes hollowed by torture, starvation, and endless confinement. He looked up, his gaze slow, hesitant, finally meeting hers. And in that moment, the entire painful, complex truth of Operation Chrysalis washed over her, not like a memory, but like a physical blow that buckled her knees. The guilt she carried was amplified 1,000 times. Thorne had a matching monarch tattoo, but it was half-scorched, mutilated, a deliberate act of cruelty and interrogation. 7, he whispered, his voice ravaged, barely a breath escaping his lungs. I knew you'd come back for the data. He corrected himself, his eyes clouding over with a terrible realization. No, I knew you'd come back for me. Thorne didn't possess a hard drive or a memory stick. He was the data. He was the only living witness to the moral choice Emily had made. The choice that led to her demotion, the loss of her team, and her exile. The original mission was simple: secure a large chemical weapons cache designated Chrysalis Prime. But during the final approach, they discovered a hidden, isolated civilian compound containing a group of children being used as forced laborers, human shields, and potential test subjects for the cache. Emily, prioritizing human life over protocol, hesitated for a crucial, life-altering hour, diverting their limited focus to the evacuation of the children. That hesitation, that single moral choice, cost them their extraction window. The enemy found the cache first, consolidating their positions, and the rest of the team died, covering the resulting ambush and their retreat. Only Thorn and Emily made it out. But the mission was deemed a political failure, and Emily was silenced, exiled to logistics. The butterfly was the mark of that failure, and the silent, unforgiving defense of human dignity. Now she faced an agonizing, impossible conflict. Thorn was too injured to walk, let alone fight. Suffering from fever and exhaustion, protocol demanded securing the asset, him, and any associated data in his memory. But she was too exposed, too deep in enemy territory. With an extraction window that had not yet been confirmed, the anguish was immediate and overwhelming. A wave of sickening regret. She could not leave him. She would not repeat the failure. The retrieval mission had been transformed into an act of pure, personal redemption. A furious, desperate attempt to reclaim a piece of her lost humanity. To justify the scars she carried, she secured the strap of the harness with a definitive, violent pull, the metal biting into her own shoulder, knowing with cold clarity that for one of them, this was a one-way trip, a debt finally being paid in blood and sweat, and she was the one whose fate was now negotiable. The transition from infiltration to immediate, desperate extraction was instantaneous, brutal, and deafeningly loud. Thorn's cryptic beacon had not been a cry for help. It had been a lure. As Emily worked feverishly to stabilize Thorn's failing vitals, with quick clot and field morphine, and strap him into a makeshift, heavy harness crafted from tactical webbing, the entire complex suddenly went live. The silent sniper she had taken out had been found, the paralyzing venom wearing off. The alarm sounded. Sirens wailed, an electronic scream tearing through the silent cold, and the rapid, heavy thump-thump-thump of boots echoed down the concrete corridors. This was no longer the clean precision of a sniper's task. This was messy, uncontrolled, close-quarters survival. A fight for every meter. She finished securing Thorn, the dead weight of his body a shocking, immense burden. She rigged a small, powerful explosive charge on the comms server, setting the timer for 5 minutes. Enough time, she calculated, to mask their initial exit and destroy any residual trace of Thorn's presence, or the nature of his interrogation. She hoisted the dead, unresponsive weight of her partner onto her back, the pain shooting immediately through her own hidden logistics desk softened muscles, and the bruised ribs from the jump. Just move, she commanded herself, the voice in her head cold, sharp, and entirely detached from the pain. One foot, then the next. Don't think about the pain. Think only about the angle of the shot, the line of retreat. She moved backward, laying down controlled, precise bursts of suppressing fire, utilizing every piece of cover, every shadow, moving in short, violent bursts. The smell of cordite mixing with the metallic tang of Thorn's blood. This wasn't cinematic heroism. It was the grittiest, most painful form of unconditional loyalty and desperate survival. She was fighting not for a strategic victory, but for one man's survival. A fight she had already lost once and was terrified of losing again. Her self-reflection was immediate and sharp. a terrible clarity born of extreme duress. She was here not for the flag, not for the mission objective, but for the man she failed 3 years ago. The moral center of the universe wasn't the objective, the cash, or the political consequence. It was this broken, wounded friend clinging to her shoulder. That loyalty, that single point of human connection, was the only redemption she needed or deserved. They reached the secondary exit, a narrow service tunnel that opened violently onto the treacherous ravine wall. She had called in the extraction bird hours earlier, a blind call to a coded ghost frequency with no expectation of confirmation. It was a long shot, a throw of the dice that had now come up snake eyes. As she scrambled down the sheer, freezing rock face, the immense, debilitating weight of thorn dragging on her harness, she felt a sharp, violent impact, a bullet grazing the side of her vest, shattering the ceramic plate and sending a jarring, agonizing shock wave through her spine and ribs. She returned fire instantly, blinding the shooter with a carefully placed flashbang. She didn't even remember pulling from her belt, moving purely on instinct. As she finally reached the bottom of the ravine, falling onto the hard, frozen earth, the faint, stuttering throb of rotor blades cut through the mountain wind, growing rapidly louder. The extraction was actually coming, a miracle of timing and desperation. She deployed a single infrared marker, a silent, desperate plea for rescue that only a pilot with high-end night vision could see. She knew the helicopter, a small, stealthy platform, could only take two, and one of them was barely conscious. She was covering the approach, laying down final, desperate fire, her last magazine almost empty, when she made her last, final choice. She reached into her almost empty pack, grabbed the small, creased child's drawing, the crayon butterfly, and tucked it securely into the pocket of Thorne's tattered, blood-soaked uniform. It was the only proof of the moral choice they had made, a testament to why they fought. She would leave nothing of herself behind. Not her name, not her mission file, only the silent, absolute, resolute survival of her friend. The sacrifice was complete, finalized by the empty weight of her own pack. She watched the helicopter land, the pilot giving her a quick, sharp nod. The decision was made. Back at Camp Hawthorne, the dusty yard had never looked so small, so irrelevant, so completely shielded from the immense scale of what she had just endured. The contrast, a surreal psychological assault. The return was as silent and unceremonious as the mission itself, adhering to the fundamental rule of black operations. Ghosts returned to their assigned posts without fanfare, without acknowledgement, without paper. Emily was medically debriefed in a sterile tent, her deep exhaustion, cracked ribs, and minor internal wounds quickly stitched and treated by a medic who asked precisely 0 questions, his face a mask of practiced, professional incuriosity. She accepted the treatment with the same rigidity she applied to her paperwork. The mission never happened. It was scrubbed from all logs, its existence erased from the official narrative. Thorne was quietly placed in a black site rehabilitation facility. The full, complex, painful truth of Operation Chrysalis remaining sealed, beneath layers of national security and political damage control. His survival owed entirely to her sacrifice. Emily simply filed her first supply report the next morning, the crushing adrenaline replaced by a crippling, bone-deep exhaustion that felt permanent, the residue of a trauma she could never share. The fluorescent light of the logistics office was unforgiving on her face, but her eyes were tired, clear, and focused on the next line item. She was, once again, the logistics clerk with the butterfly tattoo. A few days later, she was back in the chow line, the routine resuming its endless, suffocating cycle. The sound of the trays and the shuffling feet, a deafening roar after the silence of the mountain. The heat was the same. The dust was the same. And the mashed potatoes were still lukewarm. The group of infantrymen was also the same, standing behind her, ready with their low, cutting jokes. Their memories short and their assumptions intact. The specialist Hicks began to smirk, already forming the word on his lips, flutter. But before the single, dismissive word could be fully articulated, a sudden, powerful, and profound stillness descended upon the entire yard. A change in the atmosphere, so palpable it felt like a drop in pressure. It was the kind of silence that demands absolute, immediate attention. The kind of silence that means command, the highest possible level, has arrived. A figure strode into the crowded yard, moving with the deceptive, coiled grace of a man who lives constantly on a knife's edge, utterly aware of his surroundings. He was older, formidable, wearing the crisp, unmistakable uniform of a SEAL commander, the highest, most revered rank on the base. A man who represented the pinnacle of tactical excellence, rarely seen outside of the deepest, most secure administrative buildings. His presence alone caused the entire population of the Chow line to freeze instantly, their laughter dying in their throats, their idle chatter replaced by absolute rigidity. The commander was walking with a specific destination in mind, his path direct and undeviating. He walked directly toward the line. And then he stopped. He stopped right at the point where Emily Parker stood, quietly waiting for her scoop of starch, her butterfly tattoo exposed. The entire yard, hundreds of soldiers, from the newest, wide-eyed recruits to the most seasoned sergeants, watched motionless. The commander, without uttering a single unnecessary word, turned his head slowly and deliberately to face Emily. The butterfly tattoo was stark against the pale skin of her forearm. And then the action that shattered the routine, the one that defied all standard base protocol and common sense, unfolded. The SEAL commander raised his hand. His back was straight, his gaze direct, steady, and piercing, holding the weight of the entire command structure. He executed a crisp, perfect, formal salute. To Private First Class Emily Parker. Logistics. E3. The salute was the mission report the world was not allowed to hear. A silent transmission of truth that only the commander and Emily truly understood. A perfect closure on the trauma. The commander held the salute, his eyes locked on hers. An acknowledgement of a debt paid in blood. A sacrifice made. And a mission completed with impossible grace and unwavering loyalty to a higher, more human code. His gaze held the full, complex, terrible weight of Operation Chrysalis. The original political failure, the personal shame, and the quiet, fierce, undeniable redemption she had earned in the freezing dark, rescuing the sole remaining witness to the moral cost. The young infantrymen behind Emily, those who had mocked the butterfly moments earlier, froze solid, their bodies locked in disbelief, their assumptions instantly annihilated. They were not laughing now. They were watching a man who saw war in its purest, most brutal, most essential form, rendering the highest, most sincere honor to a logistics clerk. A woman whose rank suggested anonymity, but whose actions demanded reverence. It was a complete, final, and public demolition of their shallow judgment. Emily, still holding her tray, her eyes steady, her entire frame radiating quiet resilience, waited a measured beat. She did not return the salute. That would have broken the protocol she was sworn to uphold, and the anonymity she craved. Instead, she offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, a shared, silent understanding between two people who knew the terrible cost of the silence and the true meaning of the monarch. The commander finally lowered his hand, the air returning, heavy and charged with unspoken history. His voice, when he finally spoke, was soft, a near whisper meant only for her. A final confirmation. You've earned more than silence, Parker. They should know who stands among them. Emily shook her head gently, a slight, firm movement that dismissed the notion of recognition or fame. Her words were barely above the faintest breath. A commitment to her new reality. I'm just doing my job, sir, filing the manifest. And that was the end of it. No grand speech. No demand for recognition. Just the same quiet discipline and profound self-control she had always shown, elevated by the immense weight of her choice. The commander nodded one last time, a final acknowledgement of her choice, turned, and walked slowly out of the yard, leaving a profound, altered silence in his wake. From that day forward, no one mocked her. No one joked about the butterfly ink on her arm. The men who had laughed now stood a little straighter when she walked past, their voices quiet, their eyes respectful, their judgment replaced by a humbling fear of the unknown. They didn't know the full story, but they knew the cost of the salute, and they understood that her silence was the loudest statement she could possibly make. Whispers spread, fragments of truth carried from one soldier to another, about a black operation, an impossible extraction, and a choice made between a mission and a life. The true meaning of the monarch finally starting to surface. She never confirmed them, never corrected them. She didn't need to. Emily Parker remained a logistics clerk, but she became a quiet, enduring legend at Camp Hawthorne. Not because she sought fame, but because respect, earned in the coldest, darkest places, had finally been forced to find her. The monarch butterfly was no longer a sign of weakness. It was a silent seal of ultimate, moral sacrifice. A reminder that the deepest power never needs a spotlight, never needs a microphone. The logistics desk became the final, perfect camouflage for a warrior who had found her peace in the anonymity of service. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.